You're listening to the Utah Checkdown Podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown Podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be back with you again today. We're in June. The sun's out. The guns are out. Figuratively speaking, right? I don't know. My kids like to, when they were little, they had this phrase, whenever it was hot and they'd go take their shirts off outside, they'd call it beach day. So I view these days as beach day. There's no beach close to my house, but you know, you can dream, you can have some fun. So we're in the middle of summer. School's out probably for your kids if you have kids. You're probably trying to find things for them to do, but you still got football on the mind and you want to talk about football. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to do a quick updated look at kind of the CFP proposals that are happening following the spring meetings that took place last week. We'll explain some of that. A little update on the official visitors that took place last week. And then we're going to jump back into the previewing of Utah's schedule. This week will be Wyoming and Texas Tech. Two interesting games that will be interesting to see. So we'll get into that and kind of get into the football, right? Like we're getting closer. We're getting closer to football. It's still not here. But we're getting closer. So let me first tell you about our partners, Canyon View Credit Union. Every possibility begins with a spark, and possibility can grow into something even better than expected. With a clear view of what matters most, your possibilities are endless. From its first flicker at the University of Utah, UFirst Credit Union has grown to meet its potential and ignites your possibilities. They've grown into Canyon View Credit Union. Same roots, new path. Welcome to Canyon View Credit Union. Check out the full details at canyonviewcu.com. All right, let's jump into this. I don't want to bog things down too much, especially since this one's not as, I don't want to say it's not as important, because it definitely is, because it's going to be the future of the sport. But I don't want to spend a lot of wasted hours on this, knowing that we did a whole episode on this, more just trying to update on kind of where things are. So last week, for those that aren't aware, the Big 12 and the SEC both had their spring meetings last year. This is where the athletic directors, some coaches, if not all of the coaches, come in and they debate the issues that are most on their mind for their sport, right? This year they decided to combine football and basketball, so you had this, at least for the Big 12. SEC did, to my knowledge, just football. But this is an opportunity for them to come together, kind of have their conversations. And the reason why the Big 12 did it this way mostly is because this is the first true spring where all of the members, the 16 members of the conference, could get together officially and vote on certain things, right? Like if you remember last year, Utah wasn't an official partner of the Big 12 until summer. And so it was they were participating and doing different things, like Mark Harlan was there, but there's not a lot of voting power until you're an official member. So now there's a lot of officiality to it, we'll say, in terms of what they're able to do. So what has happened the last month or so is there's been this large conversation about the future of college football playoff expansions. Like I said, I'm not going to get into the weeds of this. If you want more details on kind of what this is, you can go back, I believe it's 2 or 3 episodes ago, to hear more details, get more into the weeds on kind of what this is, right? And so the big proposal that's been presented by the Big 10, and the SEC has been this 4-4-2-2-1-3 plan. It essentially gives the SEC and Big 10 the 4 teams each guaranteed spots into the playoff. The ACC and Big 12 too. There's one for the top group of 5 team, and then there's 3 at-large bids. Right, one of those could be Notre Dame if they're inside a certain metric. Outside of that, depending on if they go 14 or 16, that's what it would be. So there's those guarantees and everything. And for the most part, that's kind of been the prevailing thought, simply because the SEC and Big 10 are largely behind that, right? And since they control the future of this, or at least have the power to do it, it was believed that was going to be it. Well, as part of these meetings and kind of the conversations that have taken place recently, the first kind of counteract that the ACC and Big 12 and other conferences as well, kind of presented was that the ACC and the Big 12 should get 3. So it should be a 4-4-3-3-1-1. But that's the least likely to approve. Nobody's really wanting that one. It's not really a system. So if you've heard that, it's not really something that's there. It was more just kind of like we're going to throw out an offer and see how they do. Nobody's going to take it type of thing. The one that's starting to gain traction is this 5+11. And so what this would be is the 5 automatic qualifiers, 5 top conferences, obviously the 4 Power 4 conferences, and then the top G5 or G6, whatever we're labeling that now. And then assuming it's a 16-team model, this would be 16 at-large bids based on, straight seeding, right? So the next best, just for the sake of consistency and make this easy, let's just assume that the top teams from every single conference are 1 through 5. I know that's never really going to play out that way, but just for that. So the remaining, 6 through 16, those would be the at-large teams based on the selection committee rankings. That's the one that the Big 12 and the ACC put forth. This is the one where they feel like, you still get at least your guaranteed bid, but at the same time, you get to earn it on the field. We heard that a ton last week, the quote, earn it on the field. They want to be able to be in a system that essentially allows them to be able to still get some guarantee, get some access into the playoff, but then there's potential where you could get multiple teams in there. For the Big Ten and the SEC, that's always going to be the majority, right? Like, 65, 75, 85% of that playoff is most likely going to come from those two conferences. Outside of that, though, there could be years where some other teams could sneak in and get that, not sneak, they earned it, right? But they can get in there and get that at-large bid. This is the thing that was talked about the most, right? And they think, this has been the growing sentiment. Mark Harlan talked to Chris Vanini of The Athletic, said, I think the public and we agree that you have to win this thing on the field. He added that the Big 12, let's win more games, let's get after it. That's kind of his rallying cry. Brett Yormark, talking to the media, he told us that this was one of those things where it may hurt the Big 12, right? This may be a model that actually hurts them because under the 4-4-2-2-1, they're guaranteed 2 spots no matter what. And then maybe there could be one in those other 3, most likely not, but you'd at least get 2. In this model, there's a chance, once again, that the Big 12 only gets 1 in there. But they felt like from a competitive standpoint, from a position where they have to work with the Big Ten and the SEC, as well as also trying to do things that are going to not hamper, success or progress in the sport. They felt like the 5-11 plan is the best, right? And so you're seeing this shift of kind of where that's been. There's still this divide. The Big Ten is holding pretty firm on their 4-4-2-2-1. At least we assume so because we haven't heard anything from the Big Ten. The SEC, Greg Sankey, there's a lot of comments to digest there, and I'm not going to get into all of them. But essentially, as the week went on, it sounded like the SEC, according to Ross Dellinger's reporting from Yahoo Sports, said that this is kind of the model that they're starting to pivot towards, right? The coaches are starting to be more in favor of that. And why wouldn't they to some extent? Because you're already getting a top team, your top team guaranteed from the AQ. And then you've got a potential to be able to get as many teams in there as long as they're ranked in top the 16, right? There's going to be a lot of conversations about strengths of schedule. There's going to be a lot of conversations about strength of record, how the quality of opponent is, that kind of stuff. And the SEC and Big Ten are both going to be able to push really hard to say, hey, we have the toughest conferences. And there's not a lot of argument necessarily out of them, but there's also not a guarantee that they're always going to be that way, right? And that's the biggest push to say we don't want the 4-4-2-2-1 model simply because there's no guarantee that the SEC and the Big Ten are always going to have the best teams. Now, just, simple logic says that majority of the time, if not all of the time, they probably will, just based on all the consolidation of powers and everything. But this is kind of the protection that other conferences want to be able to say, hey, we still want to earn it on the field. The real question there comes, is that system going to be rigged for these teams? Is it going to be any better than what is presently, available? It's hard to know, right? You could go from having a guaranteed 2 teams in to only getting 1 for the next whatever years. And, based on how the money is distributed, getting 1 more team is not a small thing, right? Like, it's easy to say, well, you got access to it. Well, yeah, and you got money, but if you get a second team in, you just now doubled your money, essentially. It's not quite that easy. There's factors that go into it. But when you look at the pay disparity that's already there, and now you're allowing the Big Ten and the SEC to get more teams, which justly, they're probably going to earn more anyway. That disparity continues to grow if you only get one team in there, as opposed to, let's say, the SEC, that in theory could get 5, 6, 7, whatever number of teams in there, and it changes. My job here is not to advocate for one. That's not what it is. I'm just here to present it. I can give you kind of thoughts on based all of these. There's growing sentiment lately that the 5-11 isn't a great model, but you can make a case for each of these. So if you hear all these, that's kind of what it's talking about. This isn't going to go away. The power commissioners are expected to meet this week, if not next week, and then they're going to have a formal meeting together where they're in the same room, kind of trying to solidify this. Brett Yormark said they don't have to have a plan set until December. That's when they have to let ESPN know. That's the broadcast partners. And so they have some time, right? They can see how this season plays out. Not that I think they're going to go that far, but they feel like they don't have to rush. With that said, there's the belief that this needs to happen sooner rather than later, and kind of figure out the framework and how that all works, especially if you're expanding to 16 teams. What does that schedule look like with the schedule for the season? There's also talk about the transfer portal window. Should there be one? Should there be two? Right now there's two for football. The Big 12's push is that there's one portal period and it happens in January. That allows most teams, if not all, to be able to kind of get out of their last season, know what their roster's looking like, have, the signing day and stuff like that all underway, without feeling like they have to do all at the same time. The biggest trick there is now you have to get these players signed if you want them into spring football pretty quickly. It varies for schools, but, Utah, it's usually the middle of the month of January that they have to be enrolled to be able to be eligible for spring. So there's a lot of different things going on. Like I said, I don't want to get too far in the weeds, just kind of to update you a little bit on kind of what's being talked about, the conversations that are being had, and kind of getting in there. So let's get into more substance that are related to Utah. Sorry if you had to fast forward to that. I don't apologize. Actually, I do apologize. This is a lot. It's a lot to take in. So this last week began official visit season for Utah, essentially. This isn't just Utah. This is for pretty much every team in the country. Utah has accepted official visits before this week, as has other teams, usually in relation to kind of the spring football season. But this is the month-long period where a majority of the kids, the top-ranked kids all across the country, are going to take their official visits. So you're going to see a lot of official visit tweets. You're going to see a lot of different things that way. This first date was a big one for Utah. They had 12 official visitors, assuming that my math is correct and that I've done everything correctly to follow this. People that I've talked to, that kind of stuff. My understanding is that it's 12. It could be different. I apologize if that's the case. I'm human. But the biggest names here was 4-star athlete Celesi Moa. This is the top recruit in the state of Utah. Utah's recruited him mostly as a wide receiver, though there's talk of him potentially playing both sides of the ball. He's going to be a hot commodity, right? And I know Utah's made some good inroads there, and I know that he's been able to, find happiness, whatever that means, in thinking about Utah. But there's still a long road here. I don't imagine his commitment to come anytime soon, but this is going to be the one that is the most coveted. It's obviously the number one kid in the state, really talented kid, and a lot of potential there. So he was there. You also have 4-star offensive tackle Kelvin Obot. This is the top recruit from Idaho. Once again, we talked about this a little while ago. Utah is potentially looking to lose Spencer Fano and Caleb Lomu to the NFL draft this year, assuming that all the projections and kind of the expectations are the same. This gives opportunities for, a guy like Obot and other offensive tackles, an easier path to be able to get a starting spot, right? And if he feels like Utah is the spot, it becomes a great opportunity for him. So that's the two that are the highest priority in terms of just based on kind of the talent that they have. But Utah did pick up an official commit today. They were able to flip Boise State commit in LeGarry Mitchell. He's a linebacker from Idaho. He was committed to Boise State earlier on, took his trip, and tweeted out this afternoon that he wanted to commit to Utah. So that'll be officially Utah's second recruit. There was a second prior, but he decommitted. And so this is the second of the season. There's been a lot of conversations about kind of Utah's recruiting right now, just simply because it is slower. It hasn't materialized a ton, especially in the state of Utah. There's a lot of kids that are either already committed to, let's say, BYU, or they're committed out of state. And so it's a little bit of a shift from what Utah's had the last few cycles. On one hand, it is concerning in the sense that Utah doesn't get the traction that many expected them to get. On the other hand, recruiting high school kids has shifted, especially in the transfer portal era, as well as Utah's coming off 2 seasons that just honestly haven't been great, right? You can talk projections, you can talk about different things, but it has to be backed up on the field. And so some of their problems are obviously going to be what has happened over the last 2 years, if not last year specifically. As the season progresses and moves forward, some of those conversations that they had with kids that either have already committed or whatever may flip. You can get some of those kids if things are starting to go well, start seeing the momentum, that kind of stuff. So as much as there's people out there kind of, doom and glooming situation about the official visit, or not official visits, but recruiting in general, the sky isn't falling. Utah's going to be fine. Obviously you want to be competitive in this realm. But I think you're going to start seeing more programs, and I'm not saying even that Utah's doing this, but I think you're going to start seeing more programs. I wouldn't say devalue high school recruiting, but I think they're going to be a little bit more different in how it's done, simply because you obviously have to bring in talent, right? You've got to bring in guys that you want to be able to be on your roster, but you have to do it in a way where you feel like you can get guys that are going to stay committed to your program. Do you want to do it where you're just training up these guys so you can be a feeder system for another program? That's not ever going to go away. That's always going to happen. But how do you limit that, right? And so are you putting a ton of your eggs in the recruiting basket, or are you going more to the transfer portal? So we'll see how that goes. We'll see how it shapes up. Obviously, rules related to transfer portals and kind of NIL and different things like that will be changing. So that can add another twist. It's just an ongoing saga between trying to figure out how to recruit. So not all is lost yet for Utah. There are a few players that have official visits scheduled for Utah that they took their first visit this weekend and have already committed to a different school. Some have already decided to, take Utah off their list because they've committed. Others are still committed to that program and planning on Utah, at least as of now. So we'll see what happens. I mean, this is the time of the year where you're going to have a lot of change, right? And you're getting kids that are, 17, 18, trying to figure out the next, 4-ish years of their life. And this isn't an easy process. I know it seems easy for people, but imagine what it was like for you as a 17, 18-year-old. You probably didn't know what was going on in most of life, even though you probably thought you did. But trying to figure out the next 4 years, trying to have all these programs, wine and dine you, and try to figure out what's going to be a great cultural fit. It's not easy. So, that's my best recommendation, is just don't get too caught up in it. If a player decommits from Utah, so be it, right? Like, you want guys that are committed to your program. There's a chance anymore that you can get these guys in the transfer portal. So these recruiting visits are still important regardless of whether the player commits to Utah. There's a lot of players that Utah has been high on in years past that are now on the roster from the transfer portal. So it this is an ongoing thing. This isn't one of those things where it's just, you took an official visit, you're never going to see that kid again. There's a lot of opportunities to be there and still get that. So that's where it's at. Utah has 2 official commits to the 2026 class, and we'll go from there. You're going to start seeing things pick up a little bit, or at least you should expect to. But there's still some of these top names that I imagine they're going to take a few more visits before they really kind of solidify their plans. Let's jump into schedules. So we're 20 minutes in. We're going to do the last little bit based on schedules. So if you remember last week, we started this series talking about the road game against UCLA, the whole season opener, and then the home opener against Cal Poly. These next 2, I'm saying these next 2 of at Wyoming and then at home against Texas Tech is probably one of the most pivotal stretches of the schedule. Now, it's early, right? So it's easy to kind of downplay it because you can absorb some of these things early, especially for Utah in the scenario where, let's say, non-conference matters, but it doesn't, right? in terms of conference championships, right? They matter in terms of the full spectrum and everything. But if your whole goal is a conference championship, losing to Wyoming and losing to UCLA isn't going to be the end of the world. Now, I would argue that if you lose to UCLA and Wyoming, there's other problems, and I'm going to guess that it's much tougher for you to win a conference title. But I hope you get my point that, not all is lost, especially if they go into this game, whatever their record is, and they play Texas Tech, and let's say Texas Tech wins, not all is lost. We've seen many teams, they lose the first game, and they're right in the thick of it, right? Whether this is a building year for next year or whether this is a year Utah can compete remains to be seen. But there's potential all around. And I think based on how Las Vegas views Utah, how many are viewing this team based on kind of the people that they've brought into the program, there should be high expectations for this program. The baseline, I think, is 8 wins. I think that's where it is, right? And so let's say that they lose to Texas Tech, you're going to be okay. Baylor last year had a really poor start to the season, picked it up late, and became one of the hottest teams in the conference. It didn't matter necessarily in terms of kind of getting to the conference championship, but you're now seeing a team that has a ton of potential and forward momentum that they're looked at as one of the top contenders for the Big 12 this year, right? So like I said, this could potentially be a building year for next year. I would argue that that's not how Utah's viewing this year. I think they're viewing this very much so as wanting to compete now. It's not quite to the level or depth that Utah's had in years past, where there's a lot of returning veterans and a lot of different things that way, quote unquote, running it back. But I think they feel confident in what they've done in the portal and through the recruiting ranks to be able to say that they can compete this year, right? So we'll see what happens. As I've mentioned, I think Utah is in a good spot, but this is a pivotal early stretch in terms of kind of what we're going to see from them, right? You come into this, whatever your record may be, if you can win these next 2 games, I think that's going to be a good telltale for what Utah can be this season, especially if you can get a win against Texas Tech. You beat Texas Tech, and I think a lot changes in the kind of tone and tenor of who Utah is, right? I think Utah could go 3-0 in their non-conference schedule, and they'll get a fair amount of conversation, especially depending on how that UCLA game goes. It'll be on national TV. But if you can get a fair amount of conversation had about that, you're doing okay. But if you can go beat Texas Tech, which by all accounts this year is going to be viewed as one of the top programs in the Big 12, just simply because of what they've done in the portal, and we'll get to that, I think this becomes a great launching point for Utah to kind of push it forward, use that momentum in the rest of their schedule. So we'll see. Let's start with Wyoming. Wyoming's an interesting situation. So this game's being played in week 3, Saturday, September 13th at 6 p.m. This will be on CBS Network for all you people that love that channel. You get that. So you get Wyoming on the road. This is a game in September, so it's not going to necessarily be one of those frigid games that Utah's used to playing back in the Mountain West days. This is going to be a pretty, spring day that is going to work. The Cowboys are coming off games at Akron and then Northern Iowa, so there's nothing really to glean from that necessarily. This is a Wyoming program that went 3-9 last year, 2-5 in Mountain West play. Just really didn't have a lot of success. Really kind of took a dive, but that's not to say that this isn't a team that can kind of be disruptive. So the last time these two programs met were on October 16th, 2010. So 15 years ago, Utah won 30-6 in Laramie. Utah's won the last 4, 10 out of the last 11. This is obviously a team that Utah has done well against in years past, back in their Mountain West days. This is a team that's expected to win 5.5 games, so right on the edge of bowl eligibility, and a lot of intrigue / questions with this team. So how we got here? A lot of fans want to know, what happened here. So this schedule. This home and home schedule, I should say, home and home series, excuse me. This was scheduled back in 2017. So athletic director Chris Hill was in as the athletic director. So that's kind of how far back this was. But you have, this schedule that kind of fit with what they were doing at the time, and so there wasn't there wasn't, it doesn't, let's just say it doesn't follow the current situation. So how it goes is this was supposed to be played in 2020 and then 2025, but because of COVID and the disruption that took place there, this series got scheduled and pushed back all the way to 2025, and then 2027 is the return date to Utah. So Utah will travel to Wyoming first, and then they get Wyoming back in 2 years there. The visiting team gets $250,000, nothing too crazy. This is a contract that wasn't really anything big. It was just more an opportunity to reignite kind of the passion and the flames of an old Mountain West rivalry that has had its heated moments. So you're back. Utah fans get to travel up to Laramie. I don't know if you're excited about that. I'm excited for it. I think it'll be a fun opportunity. But I know a lot of people are questioning, why is Utah even traveling up to Laramie? And there's good reasons for it. So based on how last year went, the biggest problem for Wyoming was their lackluster offense. Let's look in the mirror right here for Utah fans, right? Like, this was not a great situation for Utah either, but Wyoming was worse. When their offense did well, and I know this kind of sounds pretty simple, when their offense did well, they generally won. They had great games against Air Force, New Mexico, and Washington State. Got all those. Their defense was good enough to be able to keep them in games most of the time. But when they had good offensive performances all around, things changed and they got their wins. So it was only 3 wins, but it worked that way. And it was pretty clear the differences there. So offense was a big reason for that, as it should be for most teams, right? If your offense isn't producing, you're not going to win games. Pretty cut and dry there. The defense still, though, remains kind of the identity of this team, right? This is a team that wants to be the hard-nosed team, wants to come in there and smash you. This is Utah, right? Like, especially the early Utah days in the Mountain West, this is what they want to be, right? You want to go in there, you want to dominate the trenches, you want to get in there and be tough and physical and really just make teams pay. And that's partially why teams that travel to Laramie have a hard time. One, you've got the altitude, especially for teams that aren't acclimated to altitude. You've got that, and then you've got a team that just wants to punish you into the ground, right? So this is a very similar type of team to Utah in that sense. They want to be able to do the same things, different things that way. QB play was inconsistent at best. Their starter just wasn't good enough. I mean, it honestly, let's see, I have the numbers right here. Where'd it go? Evan Svoboda, he threw for 1,300 yards, 5 touchdowns, 8 interceptions, but only had 49% accuracy. So just wasn't great. He's, in fact, actually moved from quarterback to tight end, so there's been a whole position change for him, and you'll see a different quarterback there, and I'll get to that in just a second. So just not great QB play. That leads to your offense obviously not doing well. So really just the problems that took place there. So that's kind of the background on this team. This is a team that is the second year of head coach Jay Sawvel. This is, a new regime there, but at the same time, it's really kind of the same structure. There's not a lot of change. It's more just a new head coach, right? And so really curious to see how that moves forward. Looking at a few key stats from last year, Wyoming was the number 1 team in opponent third down conversion, meaning they held teams the best to only 25.9% of third down conversions. For kind of a reference point, Utah was third at 27.4. So, like I said, 2 teams that are pretty similar in how that goes. This is also a team, though, that despite their offensive struggles, was 16th in the country in red zone conversion. They converted 90.6% of their trips to the red zone. The only problem is they only had 32 attempts, and so it just wasn't a ton. They ranked 123rd in attempts, and so when they got there, they were effective. They just didn't ever get there, and so that was the problem. There's other things here that they ranked pretty lowly on. They couldn't convert on third downs. They were 104th. Couldn't get first downs. They were 118th. They didn't get sacks, 127th, and they were 131st in opponent red zone conversions, meaning they basically let any team that got into the red zone get a score. There was very few times when they didn't score. It was pretty much just a wide open zone. So with that as kind of the context, that's where Wyoming has to improve, right? And I don't think you're going to see some wholesale changes to this program that's suddenly going to make it that they're incredibly great on any of those situations, right? I do believe that their offense is going to be improved. So there is that. I do believe that their defense can be improved as well. Last year was a bit of a down year based on kind of the historical look at that. But I think by and large, there's not going to be some wholesale change for this Wyoming team. So who they were last year is going to be fairly similar to what they were this year. I don't think there's enough pieces that they've brought in that's suddenly going to change this team to be a crazy amount better, right? I think there's still upward momentum, and I think Wyoming could shock a few people at times, but I don't think there's a lot there. Outgoing portal, they lost 21 players. A lot of these players, they were decent. It's not like they lost a ton of guys that were huge difference makers. That's not to say that they didn't lose guys that would be beneficial for the team. Utah was the benefactor. There you go. Benefactor? I don't know. Where are we going to go with that? Of one of these players, and that's wide receiver Justin Stevenson. He commits to Utah and comes in. Really didn't get a lot of play or production at Wyoming, and so there's still a little bit of mystery there and kind of what he can do. So curious to see his development here at Utah and what that could mean. But by and large, this is a roster that they do lose some top players, right? They lose some players to like North Carolina State, to Houston, to Colorado, Kentucky, West Virginia, that matter. But there's not a ton of players here that it's just, all is lost type speak. With that being said, they bring in 19 players through the transfer portal. The biggest names here is probably Taron Kellman, running back from Charlotte. A lot of kind of upward momentum with him as well. He's a projected starter to be in that backfield. Was the 6th best on offense at Charlotte. They like what he does there, so a lot of opportunities there. Then you have linebacker Ethan Stolzsatz. He comes from Lindenwood, so FCS. He's also expected to be a starter there. One of the best defenders on his team, 2nd best defender all around according to PFF. And so, there's a lot of optimism about him. And then Justin Taylor, a safety from Wisconsin, who's also projected starter. So you got a few guys that come in, but like I said, most of the players that came in through the portal or through the recruiting class aren't going to suddenly make this a Wyoming team that just is super competitive. They can be better, and they will be better, I assume, but this is not one of those things that's just suddenly going to just blow up, right? Looking at some of their key roster pieces, their offensive line is anchored by Caden Barnett, an offensive tackle, and Jack Walsh. He's now moved to center. These are the two guys that are going to be your best, right? And they're going to be the returners. You've got a lot of potential there, and everything's going to be decently okay for you. Still have to add more consistency there, but you're at least getting 2 key positions that are going to be effective for the offensive line, which potentially can bode well for the new quarterback and how that goes. But this is still not a finished product. They do need 3 other guys that are going to be effective there, but at least they have some veteran play there from 2 key positions that can be beneficial. Looking at quarterback. So with Svoboda moving to tight end, obviously wasn't effective as a quarterback, and so that changes things. There's an open competition for QB. Now, here, Caden Anderson, he's a sophomore, freshman last year. He's the odds-on favorite. He was thrown into a bunch of games last year, really was kind of the guy that quote-unquote won the job, but they're leaving it open to allow other players to compete in the fall. But I'd say as of right now, he's the lead guy. Who this guy is, let me kind of tell you a little bit about him. So he played 9 games, threw for 955 yards, 6 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, 58.3%. So decent, not great. Most of it was not mop up duty because they were being the ones mopped up. He was thrown in there for, opportunities he could use. There was also games where he started, if I remember my math correctly, 3 games. The biggest game for him, though, is going to be of note for Utah fans, and that's because he threw for 342 yards and 3 touchdowns against New Mexico in a 49-45 win against Utah's new quarterback, Devin Dampier. Now, what he's doing is going against New Mexico's defense, which was really its problem, so you can't put this on Devin Dampier, but you do have some familiarity there. He's obviously been able to be effective. He can do well, and is kind of, like I said, the odds-on favorite to be the quarterback for them. The other one that is getting some love is Mason Druby. I'm assuming I'm saying his last name right, but he's a freshman coming in, And there's a lot of conversation about him potentially pushing Caden Anderson and being the guy that they go to. So even though Anderson has seemingly won the job, I think Mason Druby is really pushing him, and we're going to see what's going on there. It's tough to put it into the hands of a freshman quarterback, as many teams find out. But at the same time, with where Wyoming was, there's really only room to grow up. So really fascinating development there. We'll see who it's going to be. If I'm a betting man, I would say that Caden Anderson is the guy that Utah sees in week 3, but it's hard to know based on kind of how those first 2 weeks went. They're not playing teams that I think are going to be super crazy. So I think you're going to, have a good body of work there, but also still looking to get some more, that you're going to get him. The star player here for Wyoming is their tight end. It's John Michael Gillenborg, pretty dominant player, ranked second on offense for the team, had 425 yards last year, 3 touchdowns, and was the team's second leading receiver. He's only going to get better as a senior, especially if QB play can improve. So he's a guy that Utah is going to have to factor in as kind of the top of their scouting report. Really talented tight end that's going to have a lot of success. So he's going to be kind of your top guy. Beyond that, you have 3 wide receivers, 2 that are coming back, and then 1 in a transfer of Jackson Holman from Arizona that can be effective. You have Jalen Sargent. He's a senior, had 480 yards last year. Chris Durr, he's kind of your slot receiver. He had 348 yards last year. And then Holman, he's young coming into this. But you have 3 wide receivers that can be effective. They're just not quite to the level that like you have to worry, I would say. I think Utah's defense can kind of nullify what they do a bunch, assuming that Utah is in an okay position, right? All it takes is one player just getting hot and suddenly that changes. But I think, they've got good wide receivers for what they need. I just don't think it's quite to that top tier level that is really going to make a huge difference outside of maybe like a Gillenborg as a tight end that's going to be a mismatch, that kind of stuff. Beyond that, in the backfield with the running backs, you've got a returner, Sam Scott. He's a senior. He was their leading rusher last year at only 435 yards and 3 touchdowns. Obviously going to need a lot more improvement there. But when QB play isn't effective, as we've seen, running back play doesn't work as well either. As I mentioned, you get the Charlotte transfer, Taryn Kelman. He had 242 yards last year and will be added to that. So that's kind of your offensive look. Good players, still a lot of unproven talent, but nothing earth-shattering that kind of keeps you up at night. Defensively, though, you do have 2 players that are coming back that'll lead. That's Tice Westland. He's a defensive end, was the second best defender according to PFF. And then Ben Florentine, a defensive lineman, who is also one of the top guys on defense. These 2 are experienced. They know the system in and out. They embody what Wyoming wants to do in terms of being a physical defense and really kind of creating havoc plays and really disrupting. So there's going to be attention played on them to be able to kind of lead that defense and try to get it improved. So to me, the biggest questions for this team is really just starting quarterback. Obviously, what comes with that is going to be what offense this team can be. As I mentioned previously, I think this Wyoming team can be improved. I think the offense, it's pretty tough to get worse. That's not to say that it can't happen, but I think you're going to see a better situation for Wyoming in terms of their offense than what maybe you saw last year if you decided to watch Wyoming at all. So things should improve, but once again, this isn't an offense that Utah necessarily is going to worry about or keep them up at night. Can this offense get positive momentum? How does that change if they do? How can Utah nullify that kind of stuff? And then, the other question I'd have on the other side of the ball is, can their new linebacker step up and help the team? You obviously have that front line with Tice Westland and Ben Florentine that are going to be, vital, but you need linebacker play to be effective. And they're bringing in a lot of new talent there. How does that gel? What does that look like? That's the question. And if you can't get that going, I don't know that this defense makes necessarily huge improvements. Like I said, I do see improvements there, but this is a team that, Utah, as long as they're not overlooking Wyoming, I think that they can come out with a win. There's, assuming there's no crazy storm coming into Laramie that day, I think this can be a pretty, cut and dry case for Utah if they're playing the way that they need to. But that can be a trap game too. You're overlooking Texas Tech, which 100% is going to be on their mind. Depending on how week 1 and week 2 went, maybe you're rolling, I don't know how it goes. You're coming off of an FCS opponent. How is your kind of mental state going into Laramie? Because things can spiral real quick. And even though Wyoming on paper should be a much worse opponent for Utah than others, it can real quickly spiral, and suddenly you're playing catch up in a very hostile environment. There's no love lost between Utah and Wyoming. So, really fascinating, really fun opportunity. That's partially why I put this in this pivotal stretch, is because of that situation leading into Texas Tech. So there's that. Let's jump into Texas Tech, and this is the tough one, right? This one is being played on Saturday, September 20th at Rice-Eccles Stadium. So you get them at home. This is the true first real opponent that Utah's playing at home of substance. You do get the FCS opponent in Cal Poly, but that's a tune-up game. This is an opportunity to really kind of see how you stack up in the Big 12 this year. Texas Tech, they're expected to win 8.5 games this year. They're expected to be at the top of the conference, right there with the Arizona States, some of these other teams. This is going to be the game for Utah early on, right? Obviously, there's a lot more important games later on in the season, but I would argue this one has the opportunity to be, the one that kind of changes the inflection point, so to speak, on the season. Is this one where Utah suddenly cowers and doesn't do well? Are they licking their wounds from a loss at Wyoming? What could this be? Or is this one where Utah kind of announces itself to the Big 12 and says, hey, we're actually legit? I don't know. We're going to see. Texas Tech, by all accounts, should be 3-0 coming into this game. Their toughest game is the week before with Oregon State coming to town. Based on what I've read on Oregon State, I don't see them necessarily being a team that is huge for Texas Tech. It's going to cause a lot of problems. But once again, you get one of those overlooking situations, and Texas Tech is looking ahead to Utah. Not that I think teams are necessarily looking ahead to Utah with where they're going to be projected, but it's the first conference game, right? I think everybody's kind of looking ahead to that, want to start off conference play right. It's your first road game of the season for Texas Tech, and so things can change. This is a team that finished 8-5 last year. We're 6-3 in Big 12 play. For as much as they were in contention, they kind of weren't. They were just kind of there. But this is a team 100% that can be in the mix. They can do what they need to be able to be competitive. Last year, I'm saying, was good enough, but just not great. And defense especially was really what let them down. But they have a solid offense and a lot of returning talent. And so it was, a situation where they're good, but just not great. Utah's only played Texas Tech twice in its history. They've lost both. Both were in Lubbock, Texas. The last one was back in 1973 when Utah lost 29-22. There's no recent history there. So there's not really anything that you can get from that. These are two teams that are, really fresh, starting new, that kind of stuff. So as I mentioned, this is a team that's moving on from an offense, not moving on. Well, I kind of mixed two things there. Sorry. This is a team that did really well on offense, one of the better ones in college football, but they just didn't have a defense that could match what they needed to do. They didn't have a great ground game despite having Taj Brooks. It was fine. It just wasn't as good as you would expect with him there as the all-time leading rusher, mostly because, you just had a defense that kind of let things up and they're playing on their heels or different things that way. So a team that can be effective. Some of the good things, obviously, you can see from the offense. They were 4th in scoring offense with 37.6 points, 9th in passing offense, 7th in third down conversions, 19th in red zone conversions. I mean, this is a team that was humming along, right? Offense could do its job. Defensively, though, 122nd in scoring defense, so they allowed 34.8 points. They scored more, but they allowed a ton that it made it tough for them to stay in some of these games. 133rd in passing defense. That's second to last. It's not great. It's, not a great situation for them. So teams could throw on them at ease, and that was a big problem. They're 105th in opponent red zone conversion at 87.7. And just the total defense in general is the worst in the last 5 years. It, consistently allowed way too much. So that's where it is. But this is a team that, if you've paid any attention to college football over the offseason, where you have you have a huge investment into who Texas Tech can be. Texas Tech has gone full tilt into this year being the year. They've changed their offensive coordinator. They've changed their defensive coordinator. They've brought in 1 billion transfers that are high end. They're trying to win now. And so there's a lot of reasons to believe that this team can do it. And looking at everything and following everything and trying to really research this team, I was skeptical at first, just because it's like, okay, they bring in this talent. We've seen teams do this, and then they don't work. But I think the people that they've brought in, the talent that they've brought in, legitimately makes Texas Tech a viable contender for the Big 12, if not as one of the top teams in the country. This is a team that, if they can put it all together, can be very, very dangerous. Now, with that being said, their quarterback, and I'll get into him in a little bit, he's not world beater despite the numbers that he puts up, but at the same time, if he can do enough and the defense can do enough and all that stuff, there's enough pieces around him that this team can be very, very good. So really fascinating to see what happens there. They bring in offensive coordinator Mac Leftwich. You may be familiar with that name. This was the Texas State OC that Utah was flirting a little bit with. Actually went a little bit more than flirting. They brought him in, was ready to extend an offer, had a lot of great conversations. This was supposed to be Utah's next OC. That was all the conversations that I'd heard. Everything was moving in that direction. I had my stories written. I had, different things based off of that. And then conversations broke down last minute, and suddenly he takes the job at Texas Tech. So it is what it is. Utah has their offensive coordinator now, but this was a guy that Utah scouted very heavily. They know him very well. Whether that gives them a leg up in terms of understanding who he is, that's to be debated. But this is a guy that, is getting a lot of attention out there. He likes the air raid concepts. He wants to play fast. He wants to give receivers flexibility. He basically wants to give them a billion routes, not a billion, but you get the point, where they have the flexibility to kind of do what they need to within certain constraints. You can't just go freelance everything. Only few people in the world can do that, Travis Kelce being one of them, but that still has to be worked on to understand that consistency and reps with the quarterback. But this is an offense that is going to be, high functioning, high powered, quick paced, that kind of stuff. But for anybody that thinks he's more of just an air raid type OC, this is a guy that also had Texas State up as the 15th best rushing offense last year. So they've got a lot of ability to be able to be effective in all facets of the game, which is very dangerous and very scary. Honestly, as I'm looking at this reminded me a lot of that Caleb Williams team at USC, just simply from a talent perspective. We'll see what happens. Obviously, Utah was able to get them twice in the same year, including a Pac-12 championship. So, Utah has had opportunities available to them to play these types of games and win, but I think that's how I kind of view this, right? That would be the most equivalent that I can make this Texas Tech team is probably to that USC team. They just are loaded with talent. They may honestly be better than that USC team. Quarterback-wise, no. Caleb Williams obviously is better. There's different factors there. But I think, just with the star power that they have, this is going to be a really fascinating roster to watch. So let's jump into that transfer portal. There was stories written about Texas Tech this offseason, kind of how they do things. I mean, this is one of those programs that many people are going to be paying attention to this year just to see how they do things. So really fascinated to see how this goes. Like I said, money was not an option for this. This was, give us whoever we want and we'll pay for it. They lost 25 players. Don't really lose a ton of starter production in terms of guys that were huge impact players for Texas Tech, and then they went somewhere else. Their safety, Devin Cromwell, went to Michigan State. That's probably the biggest one that I can think of. I'm probably missing somebody, but that's the one that I can think of the most. But they bring in 21 transfers, and majority of these are top-tier guys. These are four-star guys that have had been proven success already at their respective programs, are coming in with a lot of optimism and expectations placed upon them, and they're going to be listed as starters for Texas Tech. Let's see, if my note here, yes, 12 of the 21 players that are being brought in from the transfer portal are projected starters. Now, that can change, right? Fall happens, summer happens, whatever that may be. But as it stands, 12 of those guys, and the majority of them, I would assume they'd still be that regardless, are going to be starter caliber players. A few others are kind of right there, your second next man up, right? Like you're too deep right there. So this is a lot of talent that they're bringing in. Let me just read some of these names. So Micah Hudson, you may be familiar there. This is the wide receiver that Utah was courting pretty heavily. It seemed like it came down to Utah and Texas Tech. Whether he was seriously considering Utah remains to be seen. I know Utah's coaches went out and visited him. He was expected to come to Utah. It just didn't get done, but ends up going back to Texas Tech. It is what it is, right? So you have him. He's been proven, but obviously more projections based on him as well. Curious to see what happens there. But starting from a defensive side, here are your starting D-line, and they're all coming from the transfer portal. You have David Bailey, who is probably the best player on the entire team. This is a 4-star defensive end from Stanford. He's the number 1 defender in the country returning. He had better grades than Abdul Carter, who was viewed as one of the best defensive ends in the country last year. Obviously had a lot of success, goes high in the NFL draft. This is a guy that is going to be a menace for teams to handle. So you get him to come in. That's a huge boon right there for the program to be able to have him. And he's your starting defensive end. You also have Romello Height, 4-star guy from Georgia Tech. He was the second best defender at Georgia Tech, pretty high grades there. You have a defensive lineman, Lee Hunter from UCF, also a 4-star guy, 5th best on UCF last year. You then have Skylar Gill-Howard, defensive lineman from Northern Illinois. He's also your projected starter, was the best defensive player according to PFF grades there. So you've got 4 guys on your defensive line that are starters, all have proven potential. Some of those are moving up to, like the Gil Howard, he's moving up to the P4 ranks, but 3 other guys have been at the P4 level, have done well, are good. So you got your starters there. Another 4-star guy from Mississippi State is Bryce Pollock, cornerback, projected starter there, 8th best defender at Mississippi State. Cole Wisniewski, safety from North Dakota State, 4-star. If you know FCS football, North Dakota State, South Dakota State, those teams, they're solid. If you can play there, that's better than some of these G6 teams that are out there. So he's a projected starter there. He is coming off of a foot injury. He didn't play last year, but a lot of potential and optimism around him. You also get a 4-star offensive tackle in Howard Sampson from North Carolina. He's, once again, your projected starter. Was 8th best on offense for North Carolina last year. You get another 4-star offensive tackle in Will Jados from Miami, Ohio. Another projected starter, 13th best on offense there. You also have another offensive lineman in Hunter Zambrano, 4-star guy, projected starter. He only played 2 games last year, but there's a lot of optimism about what he could be. So right there, you're set again on the offensive line. That's 3 offensive line starters. You also then get a tight end from Louisiana, another 4-star guy, Terrence Carter Jr., was the best on offense at Louisiana. So he comes in and you've got him. All right, let's keep moving. You've got 4-star wide receiver Reggie Virgil, Miami, Ohio as well. He's a projected starter, was the 11th best on that team. You also have a 4-star running back in Quentin Joyner. This kid is incredible. He's young, comes in. He could be some real damage there. But once again, another starter. You then have 2 projected backups that still have a lot of talent in Anthony Holmes Jr. as a defensive lineman. And then you have Terrion Grant as a corner from Purdue, another projected backup. You've got a ton of potential right there. And I'll get into what that could mean moving forward, but that's a ton of starting potential, ton of guys with proven records, guys that are going to be effective. At least they are on paper. All of this has to come together, right? And that's the biggest problem, especially when you have 4 defensive linemen that have to work together. I'd argue that one's much easier to do. The offensive linemen, with them bringing in 3 starters, that one's a little bit more of a challenge because you've got to get that consistency, that rhythm together. I find that one to be more of a challenge. I'm curious to see how that one goes. Defensive line, I think they're going to be really strong. You get a tight end, you get a wide receiver, you get a running back. You get a lot of talent that's coming in there. Guys that I think can be proven at this, with this team. So that's the transfer portal. That's why there's so much talk about this team, because they went out and got everybody, right? And they paid a lot of money for that. So looking at the returning pieces, this is a team that is ranked 4th according to ESPN in terms of returning production. You may be asking yourself, you just listed off of 12 players that are listed as starters. Yes, I did. They have a lot of returners, but a lot of those guys are upgrades, right? And so you're going to get a lot of these guys that are going to be put into those spots. Some are replacing starters. But this is a team that has a lot of veteran leadership. They're bringing in a lot of veteran leadership. This is a team that is pretty stacked. Let's jump into the quarterback. Baron Morton. He's a senior, had a really solid year last year, threw for 3,300 yards, 27 touchdowns, 8 interceptions, 63.3% completion rate. He was the 8th highest QB in the country in yards per game and the 3rd highest in the Big 12. Only Shadir Sanders and Josh Hoover from TCU topped him. So this is a guy that can sling the ball, right? He's going to get the ball out. He can do really well. Based on the concepts that Mac Leftwich will have, this is going to be very beneficial for him. They know that they have a quarterback that can do it, right? Assuming he stays healthy, and there could be injury issues there, assuming he can be healthy, this Texas Tech team can really do whatever they need to in terms of the passing game. Assuming that all these guys, reach their potential and have what they can be, you have to like him getting at least that many yards again this year. I would assume he probably gets to at least 3,500 yards this year, just based on the talent that they have. Probably very similar production, but life doesn't always work out the exact same way. Injuries happen and things don't always work out. Teams scheme you better. You're going to be the top on everyone's scouting report, that kind of stuff. So we'll see what happens there. Running backs, you get 2 powerful running backs that are young. It's going to be a 1-2 punch. I talked about Quentin Joyner from USC. This is a kid that it's going to be really tough to handle. He averaged 7.59 yards per carry last year, had 478 yards for USC. Coming in as the projected starter, just a kid that has a lot of upside, and you're going to see a lot of potential from him. But behind him, and maybe to the side of him, we'll see, is Jacoby Williams. He was a freshman last year. He's also pretty dynamic, had 236 yards, 2 touchdowns, averaged 5.6 yards per carry. This is a 1-2 punch, honestly. Joyner, in my opinion, will be the guy, and assuming that he can kind of get a hold on that offense and do what he needs to, that's going to be dangerous, especially with a team like what Leftwich wants to run with a very fast team. This could be really dangerous where you get Joyner, picking up a few yards, you throw the ball quickly, get some more yards. There's a 1-2 punch all around that makes it tough. Top wide receivers, you've got 2 returners in Caleb Douglas. He's a senior. He had 877 yards last year and 6 touchdowns. You have Coy Eakin, Jr. He had 652 yards and 7 touchdowns. So a lot of production returning with those 2. And then you get the Reggie Virgil kid that I was telling you about, senior from Miami, Ohio. He had 816 yards and 9 touchdowns. He averaged only almost 20 yards per catch last year. Different level. That's going to change a bit in the Big 12, but he's going to be your deep threat guy. That's going to be tough. So you've got some talent there. You've got guys that Morton can throw to. You've got guys in the backfield that are going to be effective. It's going to be tough, right? Like that's an offense that you're really going to have to scheme well against, be sound on. Or else you're going to get lost, and they will beat you in whatever way possible. You may think that they may be a pass-first team. They may be, but they have the capability and talent to be able to really run the ball and do well. So you got that. Adding to that is Terrence Carter. He's the tight end from Louisiana that I talked about. He had 689 yards and 4 touchdowns, was the second leading receiver. This can be a mismatch as well. He's going to be good. He's going to be talented. Another guy that you have to factor in. You have 2 returning linebackers in Jacob Rodriguez. He's a senior, was the number 1 defender on the team last year, and you have Ben Roberts, a junior. There's still some upside for him. Wasn't as good, but still has a lot of consistency in that system. And so you've got a great base, especially behind those 4 defensive linemen that I talked about, where that front 6, front 7, depending on how they play, it's going to be pretty stacked, right? You've got veteran leaders plus guys in front of them that are really solid. This is a defense that I would assume would improve from last year. I mean, it has to. Honestly, that defense was one of the worst that they've had in the last 5 years. You get all that talent, I would have to assume that they are much better. With that being said, defense has never really been kind of the calling card for this Texas Tech team. But I think you're seeing kind of a shift in mentality that they know that they need to have a better defense, and I think they will. So to me, the biggest questions here is just how does this team gel, right? You're bringing in so many new pieces, especially guys that are expected to start. How does it all gel together? I do think a lot of those pieces, they don't necessarily have to gel in terms of like the offensive line. That is the biggest question probably. That one, they do have to gel well. They have to be consistent because if they can't be effective and Morton can't get his passes off or you can't get the run game going, this is a Texas Tech team that has a lot of talent on paper that can't do it. And then what do you do? It doesn't really matter what your defense does to an extent. But with that said, I think this defense, even though they do return a ton, I still think there's going to be a lot of questions about it, but I'm not worried about it, if that makes sense. I think this is a team that is going to be pretty stacked on both sides of the ball. You're going to have to play at your top of your game, if not near the top of your game, to be able to beat this team. I don't think they're suddenly going to be world beaters and suddenly go undefeated, but they also have the roster that they could be really solid and do well. Depends on what this Big 12 will be. They get their first test at Utah, depending on how Utah's performing. This is going to be a really fascinating game, to see which team can kind of come out on top. If Utah comes out on top, I think you're going to start seeing, people kind of thinking twice about Texas Tech, depending on how this game is played. If Utah loses, it's just another furtherance that Texas Tech is legit, and they're not wrong, right? I think Texas Tech is legit. The biggest question for people in Lubbock, Texas, though, is if not now, then when, right? That's not necessarily answering anything from this game specifically, but if this team can't do anything, when is Texas Tech going to be relevant in college football? So really fascinated to see what they do. Really talented team that is going to give Utah arguably its toughest test. I really think this is the biggest game of the year for Utah. I know it's the first game of the season, and it's really easy to say that here in June. But I think if you can set the tone there with a win against Texas Tech at home, that really goes a long way. You're going to get a lot of upward trajectory from that. You're going to have a lot of success from that, especially if you can build on that momentum. Your next stretch is difficult, but not crazy. But I think if you can get that really bodes well for you where you start to pick up steam. Let's just assume that Utah's 3-0 going into that game. You win that game, you're 4-0. Suddenly you've got a lot of attention on you, and now you've got games against West Virginia and Arizona State. West Virginia you should beat. It's on the road, but you should beat. And then you go and you have Arizona State at home, another team that is expected to win the conference. They won it last year. They're the defending champs. If you can go 6-0, and I'm not predicting that. I don't think Utah goes 6-0, but if you can go that, the sky's the limit for you, right? I think there's still a lot of questions for this Utah team as well. Similar to Texas Tech, you're bringing in a lot of portal players to, really make over your team, especially on the offensive side of the ball. I can't say that it can probably be worse, but it could be. But I think, these two teams have a lot of questions to answer, but I think Texas Tech has the better roster all around. This is a team that has gotten recent success, and you'll see what happens. But you do have to play at Rice-Eccles Stadium, where that could be a rocking environment. It could be. We've seen last year that it didn't really turn into a great place at times based on the performance that the team was giving. So that can change. But really fascinating early stretch. Wyoming, Texas Tech, really fascinated to see how that goes. This Texas Tech game, I don't want to play it up too big, but I think it can be a really big turning point for the team, win or lose. You lose, I don't know that it's a huge loss because you're probably expected to lose that game anyway, but I think it gives you a lot of potential to be able to move forward. So we'll continue this moving forward to next week. Next week, we'll talk about West Virginia and Arizona State. We'll once again an update on official visitors, that kind of stuff, who's committed to Utah, that kind of stuff. But we'll continue. And then after next week, we're halfway through the schedule. So that means we're getting closer to Big 12 Media Days and then closer to fall camp. So with that, we'll sign out today. Have a great week. Enjoy the sun. Go have your own beach day, whatever that may be, figurative or literal, and we'll catch you on the other side.